Okay, I'll get started today. Today is going to function a little bit more like a problem class. We're just going to be discussing applications of evolutionary game theory, which we've been discussing for the last couple of weeks. We're going to go through some different biological scenarios and think about how game theory can maybe tell us something about those different scenarios. And yeah, this is kind of set up, like I said, more as a problem class in a sense. So I'll run through some of these exercises, but also I think it would be good practice for you guys to work on them together, and then we go through them on the board. I would also encourage you to chat with someone else whilst you're working through them. It's not an exam, obviously. What often happens when I say like work on this problem is everyone goes pens down and just keeps silent, right? Discuss it with people around you, especially if you're stuck. Okay, so let's dig in. So there's a few different scenarios that we're going to be talking about. You don't need to worry too much about the biology. A couple of different biological contexts that we'll discuss today are timing of reproduction and primary sex ratio. I'll get onto those when we actually discuss them. Okay, so the first problem we're going to go through links back to the last lecture. So if you remember at the end of the last lecture, well, during the main part of the last lecture, we talked about matching pennies game, which was a zero-sum game that was asymmetric. And then at the end of the lecture, we introduced a different version of the game, slightly different because that was a weighted version. Okay, so the payoff table in that case looked like this. We had player 1 against player 2. This was originally set up as you versus your friend. And you can each play heads or tails. But if you and if you remember the scenario here, you each have a penny, you both show the penny at the same time, either showing heads or tails. If the pennies match, then you get $1. If the pennies don't match, then you have to pay your friend $1. So you always have one winner and one loser. So we had, for example, 1 minus 1 here, 1 minus 1, minus 1, 1, minus 1, 1. That's what we had previously. But in the weighted matching pennies game, we're going to adjust the value of these things. So the head combo is not the same as a tail combo, so on. So here we're going to assume that if you both play heads, you get a payoff of $3, and that $3 has to come from your opponent. If you both play tails, then in this case, neither of you has to pay anything. If you play heads and your opponent plays tails, they win, and they win $2 this time from you. And if you play tails and they pay heads, then you lose $1 and they gain $1. So it's still a zero-sum asymmetric game, following the basic rules. It's just the payoffs that have changed for the different scenarios. So this is in some sense a general version of the model that we looked before, or a slightly more general version. So the question is, what biological scenarios might this game correspond to? Can anyone remember what biological scenarios that the matching pennies game kind of responded to? We discussed some of these in the last lecture. Yeah. Yeah, so things that are antagonistic. You mentioned, what did you mention last lecture? You don't remember? Great. Predator prey was another example, right? We talked about also things like sexual conflict as well between males and females, perhaps. So any sort of scenario where there's potentially a winner and a loser, a victim or exploiter, tends to fit this idea of like a weighted, or any sort of matching game. So we might have victim exploiter is kind of like the most general form of these relationships. These sometimes are also referred to as consumer resource, although they're referred to as consumer resource, but it's resource other victims, and consumers are the exploiters here. So just to make sure the order of those things is correct. But the weighting here is basically saying that there is some additional costs or benefits. So, e.g., for example, predators hunting prey. in dense versus open areas. So predators might be more likely to capture prey in certain habitats. The value of grazing in a particular habitat might vary for the prey as well. In like a host pathogen context, we talked a little bit about how, say, viruses might have to match particular receptors on host cells in order to infect them. Those receptors are not just there for pathogens to bind to cause an infection. They serve other functions. For example, they might be involved in transferring nutrients or elements inside and out of cells. They could be involved in other sort of signaling as well, potentially within the host. So there might be different costs and benefits of having, say, this receptor for the host might be better at uptaking nutrients than the other receptor. Okay, so there might be intrinsic differences between them. Yes.
Is this not like also model symbiotic relationships kind of well? Like a flower and like a hummingbird, they compete in the flower size.
The difference there is that would be a mutualistic relationship, and whereas here we've got a winner and a loser each time. So in the case of like pollination, if they match in terms of like say beak size and or like probus length and the length of the I guess the aspects of the flower, then in that case, when they match together, they both win. Whereas when they mismatch, they both lose. And we'll actually get onto a scenario that looks like that a little bit later. Yes.
For scenarios like this, do the costs and the losses always have to be exact negations of each other? Like, for example, maybe the heads and heads, it could be 3 and -1, for example. Is that still a similar scenario, or is that a completely different scenario?
I mean, in some sense, in a biological sense, it's more like related. In a strict game theory sense, this is a zero-sum game because the amount that you win is exactly equal to the amount your opponent loses. But in a biological sense, there's no reason why these numbers could differ. We've kept these things the same here because for like more like structural reasons and for simplicity. But yeah, there's no reason why your payoff as, say, a predator has to exactly differ from the payoff to, or be the opposite sign to the payoff of your prey.
But when they do differ, do we stop being zero-sum?
Yes. Okay, good questions. Okay, so let's think about how we analyze this model. We're going to analyze it in a very similar way as to what we did last time. By the same logic as before, I'm not going to go through the whole pure strategy thing because for exactly the same reasons, you remember we had the 4 payoff tables and we kind of went round in a circle saying, okay, well, this can't be a pure strategy because it's always better for your opponent to switch whenever you do this, or it's better for you to switch when your opponent does that. By the same logic, in this game, because the signs are the same for these things, even though the actual payoff values have changed, there are no pure strategy equilibria, no pure strategy Nash equilibria in this game. But because it's a finite game, in other words, there's a finite number of strategies, we must have a Nash equilibrium. And therefore, if we've got no pure strategies, we must have a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium. Okay. And we defined before the idea of an expected payoff for player I playing strategy J, so that's EIJ, is some function of a parameter here, sigma k, where sigma k is going to be the probability of playing a particular strategy for your opponent. Okay, so the question then is, what is the mixed strategy Nash equilibrium for this game? So what I'll do is I'll work through this one with you, and then I'll let you guys have a go at some of the others. Okay, so if you recall, the way we solve this is we can say pick one of our players. So I'm going to look at the expected payoff for player 2. I'm going to assume sigma 1 is probability of, in fact, I call it sigma I is probability of player I playing heads. Okay, so I've defined what this sigma I is. Now we want to think about what is the expected payoff, so E for player 2 when they play strategy J, and J here could be either H, play heads, or they play tails. So what is the expected payoff for player 2 when they play heads? Well, it depends on the probability that their opponent, player 1, plays heads or tails. So player one plays heads with probability sigma 1. And the payoff for player 2 in this case is -3. So that comes from up here. When player 1 plays heads, when player 2 plays heads, the payoff is -3, and the probability of that happening, the probability of player 1 playing heads is going to be sigma 1. And then the probability that player 1 plays tails is 1 minus sigma 1. And in this scenario, the payoff to player 2 is going to be 1. So this should give us 1 minus 4 sigma 1. And then we do exactly the same thinking about what happens if player 2 plays tails. So again, they play tails. The probability that player 1 plays heads is going to be sigma 1. And in this case, the payoff is going to be 2 for player 2. Probability that player 1 plays tails is 1 minus sigma 1. And the payoff this time is going to be 0. Gives us 2 sigma 1. Can anyone remember what the next step is? I've currently got 2 equations and 3 unknowns here. Can anyone remember what I do next to solve this for sigma 1? Set them equal. Why do we set them equal?
We want to make it so that they don't like increase their payoff by changing their strategy at all.
Exactly. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to say, okay, we're trying to find some probability for player 1 playing heads that makes player 2 indifferent to their strategy. So this is player 2 straight playing heads. This is player 2 playing tails. This is their expected payoff in those 2 scenarios. We want to choose a value of sigma 1, which means that these 2 things are equal. In other words, there's no reason for player 2 to change their strategy. And that's why we're thinking about Nash equilibria. And so we want, if you remember the definition of a Nash equilibria, there's no advantage of you changing your strategy. If these things are different, then there'll be an advantage potentially of you changing your strategy. Yes, you have a question?
I think this is not a complete solution, the most general solution, because in Nash equilibrium, we say that none of the players want to change their strategy, but this should not necessarily mean that all of player 2's options give him the same expected payoff, right? Because one strategy could give the maximum. So,
But if you choose a value of sigma 1 for which these equations are equal, then there's no advantage.
But there must be a sigma 1 and a sigma 2, which maximizes both expected value of payoffs of player 1 and 2.
So we'll get onto sigma 2 in a second because we solve it the other way around, right? But but there's no other value. There's no other, when you find a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, because there's only one solution to this, there isn't going to be another solution that satisfies that.
For this specific question, it works.
Yeah.
But I think it's not general. I can make another game where this is not true. Because
in a 2x2, I'm not. I
in a
can't think of.
2x2.
Yeah, I think that there wouldn't be. I can't think of there being a way around that. I guess
It's
if you
not
had a.
non-zero sum game.
I don't think the fact it's non-zero sum makes any difference here. I think that's.
Can I, after the
Maybe in the break we can discuss it some more. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So if you go with me for now, so we've got expected payoff player 2. Like we said, we need to equate these things because we want the at a, I'm going to abbreviate it, mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, MSNE here, just for brevity. We must have the expected payoff for these 2 strategies for player 2 being identical. So in other words, we just equate these 2 things. 1 minus 4 sigma 1 is going to equal 2 sigma 1. And a little bit of rearranging. We have 1 minus 6 sigma 1 is going to equal 0. In other words, sigma 1 has to be with 1/6. So that means that 1/6 of the time, player one should be playing heads. We'll come back to a bit of interpretation of this at the end. Okay, expected playoffs. For player one, we just do exactly the same, but switching the roles. So the expected payoff for player one playing heads and the expected payoff for player one playing tails is going to equal, first of all, the probability that player two plays heads, which is sigma 2, times by the payoff that player one gets in those scenarios. So here, if player two plays heads and player one is playing heads, the payoff is going to be 3. So that's where our 3 comes from down here. And if player one plays tails and player two plays heads, the payoff is going to be -1. Oh no. If player one is playing heads and player two plays tails, with -2, sorry. Yeah. Oh no, I was right. Sorry, I've got ahead of myself. Let me just take a step back. If player one plays tails, sorry, and player two plays heads, then we have -1. So we have -1 here. Okay. Now we look at the probability that player two plays tails, which is 1 minus sigma 2. And then the payoffs in each of these scenarios is going to be entries to the left, -2 and 0. -2 here and 0 at the bottom. So you end up with 5 sigma 2 minus 2 and minus sigma 2 as the expected payoffs for player one playing heads and tails respectively. And again, at a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, we have these two payoffs, expected payoffs being the same thing. So we're going to have 5 sigma 2 minus 2 has to equal minus sigma 2. Or 6 sigma 2 minus 2 is equal to 0. Or sigma 2 is equal to 1/3. So the mixed strategy Nash equilibrium is therefore, we can write it in this form here, sigma 1, sigma 2 is equal to 6/3. We can write it in this form, saying the probability that player one plays heads is 1/6, the probability that player two plays heads is 1/3. Obviously, as there's any true strategies, the probability that player one plays tails is 5/6. Probability that player two plays tails is 2/3. When they play these strategies in these proportions, these probabilities, then you end up with a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium. There's no incentive to deviate. They can't improve their payoff when we have this scenario. Any questions on how we've arrived at this? No? Okay, so one thing to note here is that even though, for example, for player one, H has the highest payoff here, they only play H 1/6 of the time. That might seem a little bit counterintuitive when you first look at these. You think, oh, okay, well, surely they're going to be paying this more. Obviously, it's because they have the, whilst it has the highest payoff, it also has the lowest payoff as well, -3. This kind of weighted matching pennies game, I mentioned penalty kicks and penalty shootouts in the last lecture, kind of links in with these ideas as well. If you're player one, if you're the shooter and you're right-footed, maybe you're better at shooting to the right or shooting to the left, you're maybe more likely to score a goal, so your probability of scoring will be higher. Therefore, your expected payoff would be higher. If the keeper was just guessing randomly, but maybe the keeper knows this, and so that's where some of these strategies might come in. You might be better off sometimes aiming to your weaker side because the goalkeeper might expect you to go to your strong side more often. So obviously there's a bit of a feedback here, and they end up at this mixed strategy national equilibrium, which can be a little bit counterintuitive. Okay, so we've talked about heads and tails and this idea of matching pennies, but what are some biological interpretations of this? Well, if we go back to our idea of a predator-prey interaction, and suppose, for example, that in this case, we'll suppose we're going to suppose dense vegetation is tails in this case, and player one is the predator. So this is player one. Prey is going to be player two here. Dense vegetation is going to be tails, and open vegetation or open areas is going to be H. This is kind of arbitrary. I'm just assigning these arbitrarily here. There might be different scenarios where the roles of heads and tails are reversed. In this scenario, we're basically saying, okay, although maybe the predator is more likely to catch prey in the open, maybe because it can run faster, doesn't get caught in all bushes, things like that, or maybe the prey is easier to hide in dense vegetation. Conversely, you might have scenarios, if it was the other way around, where it's easier for prey to see predators in the open. But we'll just stick with this example for now. This would say that, okay, the predators should hunt more often in the dense vegetation, even though it's more likely to catch prey in the open. Likewise, the prey, even though they may be able to have better grazing grounds in the open, they're better off being in the dense vegetation. Any questions about the weighted matching pennies before we move on? No? Okay. In that case, let's discuss an example about reproductive timing. So reproductive time is important because lots of organisms have breeding seasons. For example, birds, they often have like a mating season. They try to rear their offspring in the summer months. And because of this, they have to choose when they are likely to mate. And the summer months might, they could choose to bring to breed early in the summer or late in the spring, or they could choose to breed late in the summer. There might be advantages and disadvantages of those choices. So, for example, and those choices also might differ between males and females. So, for example, arbitrarily, you might say, suppose that males prefer mating early in the season, and females prefer mating later in the season. Males perhaps want to maximize the total number of mates they might have, so they want to start mating early. That might be one of these things, whereas maybe females want to wait and see and choose amongst the best males and try to analyze which males are perhaps have the best traits, and therefore they want to wait a little bit longer. And so we might assume that if males are able to mate earlier in the season, they tend to have more mating opportunities. Maybe they have a higher payoff, and so it's preferable for them, so they have a preference there. And likewise, females, perhaps because they've been able to wait and choose, if they mate in the late season, then they can exercise that choice more judiciously, and therefore they have a higher payoff. Reasons why things might vary, perhaps weather might be more unpredictable early in the season, so there's a bit of a gamble to this. That's why females perhaps may not want to mate early in the season. Males perhaps may not want to mate late in the season, perhaps because there's a more competition for resources. Maybe the males from the previous year have had a little bit longer to grow, and they're now competing with more males and females. So there's lots of different reasons as to why the timing of these things might be advantageous for one sex versus another, and why the advantages may vary over the course of the season. Okay, so we want to come up with a payoff table, just like before. Again, this is an asymmetric game because we've got males and females differing perhaps in the payoffs rather than the actual strategies themselves. So let's assign some weights to these things and come up with a payoff table. So arbitrarily, I'm going to put males here and females here. And then we're going to think about early season, which I'll call E, and late, which I'll call L. Don't confuse this capital E with the fact that we're going to use capital E for expected payoffs. And we're going to have the same strategies E and L for males. And I'm going to assume that if an individual mates in its preferred season, preferred time within the season, so males prefer mating early, then they get twice the payoff than they would if they mate in the later season. Okay, so in this case, males, I'm going to say they have a payoff of 2. They mate in the early season. If they mate in the late season, they'll only get a payoff of 1. And conversely, because this is going to be sort of flipped around in terms of early and late for females, if females mate in the early season, they don't prefer it, they only get a payoff of 1. If they mate in the late season, they get a payoff of 2. And then we're going to assume here that if the males and females mismatch, then they don't rear any offspring. And therefore they get a payoff of 0. They both get a payoff of 0. This game is also known as Battle of the Sexes. And there's different contexts in which you could apply this. So, okay, the question is, and I'm going to assign you guys to do this, and I'll walk around and answer any questions you have. We need to find all Nash equilibria for this game. Okay, pretty straightforward. Any questions? No? Okay. Like I said at the start, feel free to discuss with your neighbor. They probably won't bite. Okay, can I have a show of hands who thinks they've managed to solve this? Okay, a couple of people. Okay, I'll start going through it. We've got plenty of time today, so I don't want to rush these. I want to make sure that no one's sat there being too stuck. Okay. Let's think about pure strategies to start with. Suppose I am currently playing early. Suppose I'm, as a male here, I'm playing early and my payoff is 2. There's no advantage of me changing to late because I would reduce my payoff. So definitely don't want to change in this direction. For the female in this scenario, her payoff would be 1. If she changed to late season, her payoff would be 0. So she would be reducing her payoff. Therefore, this is a Nash equilibrium, early, because either of us changing our payoff, either of us changing our strategy would reduce our payoff. So early is a Nash equilibrium. By exactly the same logic, late is also a Nash equilibrium. So we have 2 pure strategy Nash equilibria here. So clearly early and late are pure strategy Nash equilibria. And what else are they? They're also strict. So they're strict Nash equilibria here. In some sense, they, I'll say this very cautiously, there is a sense of evolutionary stability here, but not in the formal sense of how we've defined an ESS, because remember, in an asymmetric game, we can't have an ESS because there are issues of strategies don't actually play against themselves, as well as things like what happens if both individuals change their strategies at the same time. But there is a sense here you can intuit that if everyone in the season, if all males and all females were mating in the early season, and a rare male decided to mate in the late season, or a rare female decided to mate in the late season, they would have no mates, right? So there is a sense here that there would be some sense of evolutionary stability here. Likewise, if everyone was mating in the late season, being the only one that mated in the early season would clearly be disadvantageous. You would have to have a sufficient number of individuals switching. So there is a certain sense of evolutionary stability in this model, even though in our sort of formal mathematical sense, we can't really assign it here. Okay. So we've got two pure strategy Nash equilibria. Are there any other Nash equilibria here? I'm seeing a few nods and a few heads shake. So we could also have, are there any mixed strategy Nash equilibria? Okay, so this is the other thing we need to check. We need to, first of all, define some probabilities of playing different strategies like we had in the previous matching pennies scenario, and then solve for the expected payoffs, okay? Sigma M, I'll call it sigma I, be the probability that individual I, so that I could be male or female, plays or chooses to mate early. It's called, make it explicit, chooses to mate early. Then if we think about the expected payoff for females who either mate early or late, this is going to be the probability that males mate early, sigma M, times by the payoff for females in those scenarios. So if males mate early and females mate early, there's a payoff of 1. If they differ, there's a payoff of 0. Be that way around this time. Yep. So if they both mate early, females get a payoff of 1. If they both females mate late and males mate early, there's a payoff of 0. And the probability that males mate late is going to be 1 minus sigma M. If females mate early, they get a payoff of 0. If they mate late, they get a payoff of 2. So we end up with sigma M and 2 minus 2 sigma M. And as before, these have to be equal at a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium. So we're going to have 2 minus 2 sigma M has to equal sigma M, or sigma M has to equal 2/3. In other words, males will mate early with probability 2/3. And then exactly the same for females. Down here, similarly. If we think about our expected payoff for males, when they mate early or late, this is going to be equal to the probability that females mate early, sigma F, times by the payoff in each of these scenarios. So here we're going to have a 2 and a 0 to start with. This is the payoff for males. So we have a 2 here and a 0 here, plus the probability that females mate late is 1 minus sigma F. If males mate early and females mate late, then males get a payoff of 0. If they both mate late, then males get a payoff of 1. This gives us 2 sigma F and 1 minus sigma F. Again, at a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, we have to have these two things being equal. So 2 sigma F must equal 1 minus sigma F. In other words, sigma F is equal to 1/3. So our mixed strategy Nash equilibrium occurs at sigma M, sigma F equal to 2/3, 1/3. Remember as well that this I've defined to be the probability of mating in the early season. So the other way of thinking of this, the probability of mating in your preferred season is 2/3. Because for males, their preferred season is early, the females, their preferred season is late. Who got that? Okay, good. It's relatively simple in the sense that we're just setting up some linear equations and then solving them simultaneously. Okay, it's nothing too complicated. Note that we don't actually care in these scenarios what these values of E are. We haven't actually, we just eliminate the expected payoffs. Obviously, we could go back and substitute these in and work them out. That's what we can do here. So we might actually be interested in what is the expected payoff for each player at a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium. And we can do this by working out, multiplying the probability of each outcome by the payoff for each outcome to that player. Okay, so this again is just a weighted sum. To make sure this is clear, we can just write it out in a table again. You don't have to write it out in a table, but sometimes that can just help for visualization. Okay, so one way you can look at this is we just write out our payoffs again. And then we know that males are going to mate in the early season with probability 2/3, and in the late season, probability 1/3. Females are going to mate in the early season with probability 1/3, and late season, probability 2/3. So what's the probability that males and females both mate in the early season? Anyone?
Repeat the question.
What's the probability that males and females both mate in the early season?
Nice.
Yeah, why?
2/3 times 1/3.
Exactly, so it's just 2/3 times by 1/3. So the probability of that outcome is just multiplying what we had in the corresponding row and column. So probability that males mate in the early season and females in the late season is going to be 2/3 times by 2/3, or 4/9. Both in the early season, sorry, males in the late season, females in the early season is going to be 1/9. And both in the late season is going to be 2/9. Like I said, you don't have to write it out in this format. Sometimes it can just help visualize to make sure that you haven't made any mistakes. So then we can think about, at our Nash equilibrium, what is the expected payoff for males and females? I'll just denote this with an asterisk. What we then do is we just multiply out all of these things. So we're going to have the payoff that we would have when males and females mate early, which is 2, times by the probability that that outcome occurs, which is 2/9. So for males, we'd have 2 times by 2/9, plus 0 times by 4/9, plus 0 times by 1/9, plus 0 times by 4/9, plus 0 times by 1/9, plus 1 times by 2/9. Which gives you 6/9, or 2/3. Likewise, we do exactly the same for females. They will have 1 times by 2/9, plus 0 times by 4/9, plus 0 times by 1/9, plus 2 times by 2/9. So 1 times by 2/9, plus 0 times by 4/9, plus 0 times by 1/9, plus 2 times by 2/9. Again, this equals 6/9 or 2/3. Okay, so why might we care about this? Well, let's think about these values that we've ended up at here. And our mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, which you can think of as being a compromise, right? males are not always getting what they want, females are not always getting what they want, you might think that a compromise perhaps is the best thing here. Okay, if they don't collaborate, if they both mate in the late season, sorry, if one mates in the early, one mates in the late season, then they're not going to produce any offspring, they both lose. That's obviously something they would both want to avoid. Males want to mate in the early season, females want to mate in the late season, perhaps they compromise. This mixed strategy, a Nash equilibrium, can be viewed then as a compromise. You try to mate in the season you prefer 2/3 of the time, but a third of the time you mate in the season, or the timing of the season you don't prefer. This, following this strategy, gives you an expected payoff of 2/3. What do you know then about these expected payoffs relative to the pure strategies? Yeah.
They can both get like a better payoff by just playing like a pure strategy of early or late.
Yeah. So obviously playing your preferred strategy, you'd expect to have, so for example, if a male, if you know that the males are always going to mate in the early season, as a female, you would be better off just essentially submitting in that case. And likewise, if you knew that all the females were mating in the late season, as a male, you'd be better off submitting because your payoff, even in your worst case scenario of just doing what the opposition wants, opposition other sex here, is going to be one which is higher than the compromise. So this is one of those scenarios where actually like compromise actually gives a lower average payoff than if you just do what is your least favored option. Okay, so there's a sense here that all of the Nash equilibria are deficient, and deficient in the sense of none of them are particularly satisfying, okay? If they always choose to mate in the early season, both males and females, then females are not getting what they want. If they always choose to mate in the late season, then males are not getting what they want. But if they compromise, then their actual average payoff goes down, both of them. By the way, do not take any moral lessons from these lectures on game theory. So teaching game theory is always an interesting one because it's a little bit dangerous of drawing any sort of moral lessons about, especially when it comes to things like cooperation or compromise. But it does tell something interesting in the sense of like, from an evolutionary perspective, these games help us to think about problems with some of our intuitional thinking. You know, I mentioned before about we might imagine that evolution naively does what's good for the population and what's good for the species. If evolution sent you towards this mixed strategy Nash equilibrium here, there was ending up being a compromise, then actually that gives a lower average payoff than if you just favored one or the other. Evolution doesn't have any foresight to be able to say, okay, well, actually, we're better off at one of these pure strategies. Evolution could drive you, for example, towards this mixed strategy Nash equilibrium. We're not, again, talking about the actual dynamics here of how we attain these things, so we're not going to go into that just now. We'll try and come back to some of these questions over the next few weeks when we talk about adaptive dynamics, about whether we can actually obtain or how we might move towards some of these equilibria and whether they are stable in different senses. But I guess, yeah, the idea here of game theory maybe telling you something about it's difficult sometimes to get some of these processes like collaboration started, or it's difficult to get cooperation started. And even if you do cooperate or collaborate, it might be not necessarily be what's actually best for the population as a whole. Or rather, sometimes what evolves is not best for the population as a whole. Okay, that's a pretty good place to stop. We've got a couple more scenarios I wanted to go through afterwards. So why don't we take like a 10-minute break and then we'll reconvene again. It's about 10 minutes, so we can start on the second half. So we're gonna now think a little bit about sex ratio, which was kind of has formed quite a rich history in evolutionary biology. And sex ratio is all about the balance between males and females in a population. It's easy to put on a very human-centric hat when we think about this and we say, well, there's roughly equal males and females. From an evolutionary perspective, why might that be the case? And also what happens when that breaks down? So there are lots of organisms where there's a really strong bias between males and females. You might have 1,000 females for every male, or vice versa. Why might that be the case? So there are different types of sex ratio. There's a sex ratio, well, I think it's actually the secondary sex ratio here. I call it the primary sex ratio, the sex ratio at birth. I'm going to collapse these things down into the same thing. So you might see this written as secondary sex ratio. There's sort of different stages of life. There'll be a primary, a secondary, tertiary sex ratio. Here I've just called it primary sex ratio just to think of that early stage in life. But also there's a sex ratio in terms of like gamete production and fertilization. There's a sex ratio that might differ at actual birth. So these things can differ, but I'm going to collapse them into one thing. Anyway, the idea here is that as an individual, you produce gametes, and those gametes in sort of invertebrates here, or at least in humans. I'm going to exclude birds from this because birds are actually the other way around. The Y chromosome is dominant and determines the sex of the offspring. Okay, and you might think that, well, okay, in humans it's roughly 50-50 in terms of the sex ratio because of Mendelian segregation, right? You start off with, say, XY or XX chromosomes as a male or female parent. And when these split up to produce your gametes, well, half of them end up having an X if you're male and half of them have a Y. And then likewise in females, all of them are going to have an X. So is that where the 50-50 comes from? Well, that's kind of what a few people thought, but then thinking about it a little bit deeper, remember back in lecture 5, we talked about meiotic drive. And meiotic drive was all about distortions in gamete production. You can think of it being a little bit more general in terms of when it comes to mating, that, say, for example, females could preferentially kill sperm that have a Y chromosome. If there was something on the X chromosome that said, we want the X chromosome to spread. Again, evolution has no foresight, even if this crashed the population, right? Maybe there's something on the X chromosome that produces something that identifies and kills sperm with the Y chromosome. Likewise, in males, maybe there's something on the Y chromosome that kills sperm that have the X chromosome. Now, initially, you might expect then, well, that's going to increase the frequency of either the Y or the X chromosome in males and females, and therefore that should help it spread, right? Because it's going to be more common. So when mating occurs, there's fertilization. If for example, females are preferentially killing sperm with the Y chromosome, then they're going to be producing more daughters. There's going to be more of this X chromosome spreading again. If anyone's read The Selfish Gene, who's read The Selfish Gene? You're all terrible. The Selfish Gene, written by Richard Dawkins, is all about thinking about the levels at which selection operates, getting away from this idea of what is good from the population, what is good from the species. There is no foresight to evolution. We'll talk about cases later in this course about where evolution can actually drive populations extinct, which seems maybe a little bit counter to this idea of survival of the fittest. There's no foresight here. So why don't we see, say, male individuals, the Y chromosome killing sperm with the X chromosome, or likewise females with something on the X chromosome that kills sperm the Y chromosome, or just rejects them. Okay, so we're going to be thinking about these distortions. We can think about it from a game theory perspective, and some of the early game theory ideas actually came about thinking about sex ratio as well as animal contests. This has kind of a long history in game theory. So let's consider a large population of males and females mating randomly. Large population means that we could ignore any stochastic effects. We're going to suppose that the frequency of males is P, and the payoff to an individual producing a son is equal to the frequency of females. It's all about you can think of this in terms of their probability of being able to find a mate. If you produce a son and there are lots and lots of females around, they're just more likely to find a mate. If you produce a son and there's lots of males around, they're less likely to produce a mate. Okay, so we're going to say that the payoff to an individual producing a son is equal to the frequency of females. And the payoff to an individual producing a daughter is equal to the frequency of males, just the opposite way around. Again, all about being able to find a mate in the next generation. You want your offspring to be able to find mates so they can continue reproducing and passing on your genes. Okay, We're also going to suppose that females determine the sex of the offspring. So males are going to have essentially no role in determining the sex of the offspring here. We're assuming that males are going to be producing lots of gametes that have both the X and Y chromosome, but females are going to be able to choose. There are examples of females being able to reject sperm based on certain characteristics. So we're going to assume that females can reject sperm with either the X or Y chromosome. So let's think about what a payoff matrix looks like in this scenario. So again, we've got males and females. We think about their strategies as producing sons, S, or daughters, D. Both are being able to produce sons and daughters. So this is actually going to be a symmetric game. The payoff is going to be the same because when a male and female mate, they produce a son, that son has the same payoff regardless of the strategy that's being employed by the males or females, likewise with daughters. So what is the payoff for this box up here? Yep.
In the frequency of females, so 1 minus P.
Yep, exactly. So 1 minus P, and it's the same for males and females, so I'm not going to write it out twice. We can just write this as a symmetric matrix. Okay, just because it's easy, we'll jump down to this box down here. What about daughters? P. Okay, so it gets slightly trickier. How about this box down here? This is males wanting to produce daughters and females wanting to produce sons. Any ideas? Maybe you reread the last sentence again of the paragraph. So females are going to be the ones determining the outcome. So females can choose whether they accept or reject sperm with an X or Y chromosome.
This should be 0.
Not 0, because males may want to produce daughters. So you can think of this as being they're perhaps overrepresenting daughters in their gametes. But they're still producing sperm that have the Y chromosome. This is why it's a little bit tricky. This, in this case, is just 1 minus P. So the reason it's 1 minus P is because we're saying that females determine the sex of the offspring. Another way of thinking of this game, maybe it's a little bit easier way of thinking of it rather than at the gamete level, is you could suppose that you get to the stage where females give birth to their offspring and they kill all the male offspring if they don't want males, and likewise they kill all the female offspring if they don't want females. That would be an extreme version of this, right? So basically, the females are just choosing the sex of their offspring, or they kill a proportion of them if we're having a mixed strategy, right? How about this box up here? Yeah, again, it all depends. It doesn't matter what the males want here, the females are deciding everything. So the males are really irrelevant. This looks a bit odd because it's not like any of the games that we've had set up before. Okay, so let's find Nash equilibria for the system and hence determine the optimal primary sex ratio. So I'll work through this one with you guys. So the male strategy has no impact here. So by definition, that means that it doesn't matter what the males want to play, since their choice doesn't matter. So we actually only need to think about the payoff for females. So the expected payoff for females is just going to be, well, we've got a bit of feedback here. It's going to depend on the frequency of males in the population. Okay, so before we had the probability that player one plays a strategy times by the payoff of that strategy. Here, we're going to have the probability of males playing that strategy actually depends on the previous generation. We're assuming that males are a frequency of P. So here we're going to have the payoff to females is going to be P times by 1 minus P. And here, this first P here is the frequency of males times by the payoff that those males would get. 1 minus P plus 1 minus P times by P, the other way around. So for daughters, times by males. Okay, this one's a little bit confusing. So this simplifies down to 2P times by 1 minus P. All this is really saying here is the payoff for the payoff for females producing sons is 1 minus P. And they're producing sons in a proportion P. So we're assuming that those males are at a frequency of P in the population. Likewise, their payoff of producing daughters is going to be P. And they're producing daughters at a rate 1 minus P. So this P is the only variable that we have here. So it's confusing because P both features in the payoff, but also P is the frequency that they're producing males or females at. Okay. So what do we need to do? Well, we want to find an optimal primary sex ratio. So any ideas about how we're going to find the optimal primary sex ratio, given that this is the expected payoff for females? Yep, so how do we find that?
This is a quadratic. So,
Yep. Okay, so how do we find the maximum? Take the derivative, right? So EF is maximized when derivative of this DEF dP is equal to 0. In other words, 2 times by 1 minus 2p is equal to 0, or p is equal to a half. So the optimal primary sex ratio here falls out of the payoffs. P is equal to a half. Has nothing to do with Mendelian segregation here at all. Remember, just going back up to this slide here, this middle paragraph here is saying, well, maybe intuitively you might think that the reason we end up with this 50-50 is something to do with Mendelian segregation. When we set it up in terms of this simple example here of choice as to how, in this case, females are choosing, and I've arbitrarily chosen females here. We could have set it up as males. We could have set it up as a combination of these things. This is just a way of doing things in a very simple way. Or rather, the optimal primary sex ratio here is going to be a half. So you should produce males and females in equal quantity. Intuitively, this should hopefully make some sense. There's actually some deeper analysis you can do this. I've kind of simplified this problem not quite oversimplified it, but it's presented in a very simplistic way. One of the key insights that Fisher, who is one of the fathers of the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory, one of his insights was thinking about, well, evolution doesn't care about, or rather how you count fitness doesn't matter in terms of whether you're counting it in the next generation or 2 generations down or 5 generations down. So what you can do is you can think about your production of an individual's production of sons and daughters, but then also their production of granddaughters and grandsons, which will depend on their production of sons and daughters. Okay, so it's a little bit confusing, but essentially there's a way, again, you can think about counting up over many generations. You actually just need to look 2 generations into the future to work out what is the sex ratio. Ultimately, you end up with the same thing. So the whole point of this is that if you start overproducing sons, then there's an advantage to producing more daughters. If daughters are overrepresented, then there's an advantage to producing more sons. So this is a balancing effect that pulls you back to this half. Okay. So that's, yes, please.
And, the matrix was only talking about the payoff for females, or you
Yes.
expect that, or you assume that for the males, the same, but we do not care about males.
So we don't care about males because they have no decision power in this, as we've set up this matrix here. So it doesn't matter what the payoff is for males, changing their strategy has no effect. In some sense, they're indifferent automatically because it doesn't matter what they do. Females here have the choice. So yeah. So that's why we only had to look at females in this scenario. Okay, so you can think of that as being a bit like a null scenario. Like your basic expectation should be that if there's nothing else going on, and like I said, you can do this in different scenarios, not when it's just determined by females, but your null scenario is that there should be equal sex ratios. Okay. So this holds, in fact, in more general theory, regardless of whether adult males or females have a higher mortality rate. So often cases say males might have a higher mortality rate than females. It breaks down, it doesn't break down in terms of things like mating system as well. So if you have like harems and things like that. One of the ways, or one of the interesting things in evolutionary biology then is thinking about when do these things break down. So yes, you have this null idea that sex ratio should be equal, but we see lots of examples where they're not equal. Again, if we take off that human-centric hat for a moment and think about other populations, whether the sex ratios are very biased, question then, when do we see these things? And so that's when people have expanded the theory to think, sort of more rigorous way, thinking about what happens if there are differences in, say, mortality rates when they're adults. You might think that that would distort it. Okay, if males are more likely to die when they reach adulthood, maybe it's more advantageous to produce females. Turns out that doesn't matter at all. The key thing that matters, perhaps, what we're going to look at here, is what if one sex requires additional investment from parents when they're young? Okay, so either they require additional investment from parents, or that could arise in a few different ways. For example, maybe it's more costly to rear a male than a female. Perhaps the males are larger, and therefore they require more nutrients. So before, say, a male chick fledges, maybe they require more food. Therefore, there's more investment for the parents to produce offspring that are male. In this case, we're going to suppose the opposite. Suppose females require additional investment when they're young. So the payoff of producing a daughter is reduced by C, where C is between 0 and 1. Okay, so now we need to think about what is the primary sex ratio now. Does this have any effect? Okay, so in this case, what's our payoff matrix? We're going to have sons and daughters again for males and females. As before, we're still assuming that females are making the choice, so our rows are not actually going to differ here. In the case where females choose to produce sons, the payoff is 1 minus p. Remember, p is the frequency of males. 1 minus p is the frequency of females. This 1 minus p comes about because we're essentially saying it's more likely that females can find, more likely that sons can find a mate if there are more females in the population. Then for daughters, we're assuming there's an additional cost of producing daughters. So before we had p, now we're going to have p minus c. C is some cost. As before, the male strategy has no impact. We just need to look at the expected payoff for females. And by the same logic as before, we had p times by 1 minus p plus 1 minus p. But now, rather than times by p, we're going to have p minus c. So here, this is the frequency of females that are produced times by the cost. Or the payoff here, you can think of it, the payoff minus the which includes the cost. Okay, so expanding this out, we get 2p minus 2p squared minus c plus cp. Expanding things out in terms of p. And as before, if you remember, we looked at when EF is maximized. when is the payoff to females maximized? This is when DEF dP is equal to 0. Okay, so taking the derivative of this, we're going to have 2 minus 4p plus c must equal 0. So this is just the derivative of df with respect to p. So rearranging for p, we're going to get p is equal to 1/2 plus c over 4. So hence, the optimal sex ratio is 1 plus c over 2 to 1 males to females. Remember, p was our frequency of males. So we see when there's no additional cost of investment to producing females when c is equal to 0, we just go back to our 1-to-1 sex ratio. But if there's if females in this case are more costly to produce, if c is greater than 0, then we end up increasing this sex ratio. Again, there are different ways in which one could set this up. One could put the cost on males instead. One could incorporate the cost in a slightly different way. The key thing here, though, is that as soon as we have a cost of investment, remember, this is the payoff to those parents. It's the payoff to those parents. It's going to depend on the probability that their offspring are going to be able to find a mate, as well as the cost of producing that individual. Given that females are more costly to produce, here you should actually produce slightly more males. Does that make sense? Okay. The last scenario I wanted to go through is about fairness. Again, don't take any moral lessons from this. But fairness, again, you might think of it as being a human trait, but there are lots of examples of animal societies, especially in primates, understanding concepts of fairness. There's a famous experiment actually where there's a video, you can find it on YouTube, where there's 2 monkeys in cages, and the experimenter is giving, I'm trying to remember what it was now. I think it's grapes. I think they like grapes, maybe. Grapes are apparently very tasty and valuable. Gives grapes to one of the monkeys, and then gives some low value treat, I can't remember what it is, to the other one. And the other monkey's kind of like looking over, being like, what gives? Like each time he thinks, oh, I'm going to get a grape this time. And then so there's demonstration definitely of understanding concepts of fairness. If you've ever met my dog, it has to have all of the food. That's its concept of fairness, is that everything belongs to it. Anyway, the point is that many species, including primates, the idea of some kind of resource sharing in these social communities is quite common. And there also can be hierarchies within these. You might think of like a silverback gorilla as being like a dominant ape. There may be some, in sort of dog packs as well as, alpha females and males. So individuals might vary in their status within these social groups, and how resources are divided up within those groups might depend on that hierarchy, this dominance hierarchy. So key question then is how do we maintain some sense of social cohesion within these groups? Should it always be that these dominant individuals just take all the resources for themselves? Perhaps there's a cost of doing that. Although individuals that are not dominant within that group might have less power, maybe perhaps in a physical sense, perhaps in a social sense, they can still make choices. They can do things like reject offers. They could respond by engaging in aggressive behavior or not cooperating in future endeavors. They might not help raise their offspring as much if they're not being treated fairly. So evolutionary questions then about, how do we balance selfish behaviors versus fair behaviors? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to suppose that a dominant monkey finds a large food source worth some increase in fitness B, 0, so that's going to be its payoff if it takes it for himself, and must decide how much to share with a subordinate monkey. So the dominant monkey makes the decision here, and if the subordinate monkey finds the share unfair, it might reject the offer by engaging in aggressive behavior. So what I want you guys to do is to write down a payoff matrix or a payoff table where the dominant monkey either shares the resource worth B, and they could do this fairly, and by fair here I mean equally, or it can share it unfairly. And assume that if the subordinate monkey rejects the offer, then it receives nothing, and the dominant individual receives the whole food source, but pays a cost. And this cost is going to be some value C greater than 0 due to the subordinate monkey's behavior. Perhaps it's aggressive towards the dominant monkey. Maybe it doesn't help it out in terms of raising its offspring. So we'll have a go at writing down a payoff table for the dominant and subordinate monkeys when they have fair shares or unfair shares, and when the subordinate monkey accepts or rejects. Their cost is essentially
That's not realistic.
I mean, again, I think a very good question. That's like, we talk about like what is realistic in a hurry, right? Like, these are, in many ways, overly simplistic examples, but sometimes like there's the sex ratio one, they can give you some insights that you might ordinarily not have, and you might think, oh, actually, it's not about Mendelian segregation at all, it's about the payoffs. So they can give you some insights, but also kind of have to take them with a little bit of a pinch of salt because they are very simplistic. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully you guys have got a payoff matrix here. Let's have a look, see what this looks like. So I'm going to put my dominant individual here. And subordinate here. And the dominant individual can either give a fair share, or F, or an unfair share, U. And the subordinate can either accept A or reject R. Okay, so if it's a fair share offered by the dominant individual and the subordinate accepts, what are my payoffs going to be? Yep, so B over 2, B over 2. If it's a fair share, but the subordinate rejects, yep, B minus C and 0, because although the dominant individual gets all of the resource now, it has a cost it pays of C. What about if it's an unfair share and reject? The same, yep. And if it's an unfair share, I'll do this one just because I'm introducing another parameter. I'm going to call this SB and 1 minus S times by B, where S is between 0 and 1, is the proportion of the resource that dominant individual receives in this scenario. Yes.
So it's 0 and 1 inclusive, because it could be really unfair, just take it all.
Yeah, and unfair here, I mean, I've written this unfair in the most, it's unfair in the sense it might be unfair to itself, right? Because this is going between 0 and 1, so it might not take anything and give everything to the subordinate monkey. So maybe unfair, if you can think of as equal and unequal shares, maybe the other way of thinking about this. Who got a matrix that looks something like that? Fantastic. If you do ever, when you're thinking about things like assignments and exams, if you are introducing parameters, make sure you define what that parameter is, and it's its bounds, or whether it's a real number or positive, whether it's bounded, and so on. Okay. Okay. Let's see. There's plenty of time left. I'm going to let you guys work out if there are any Nash equilibria and the SS's. And then if you can as well, think about any interpretation that you can draw from that in a biological sense. Okay. Okay. Let's work through this one. This one's a little bit confusing as well. I tried to pick a few examples that are a little bit more unusual compared to what we've met so far. Okay, so let's think about pure strategies to start with. So dominant individual playing fair and subordinate playing accept is a Nash equilibrium if B over 2 is greater than or equal to SB. Why is that? Well, if we're up in this corner here, for me, if I'm the dominant individual, as long as B over 2 is greater than SB, then I have no reason to switch. For the subordinate individual, B over 2 is always greater than 0, so there's never an incentive for me to reject it, switch to reject. So as long as the dominant individual, S is less than or equal to a half, there's no advantage to me switching. So in that case, fair share, and the subordinate individual accepting is a Nash equilibrium. Likewise, unfair accept, unfair accept is a Nash equilibrium. Sorry, my notes are wrong here. I've got it written down. That's a Nash equilibrium if B over 2 is less than or equal to SB. In other words, with these highlights, if as a dominant individual, I offer an unfair share, if SB is greater than or equal to B over 2, then there's no incentive for me to switch. As a subordinate individual, this payoff here of 1 minus S times by B is always greater than 0, so there's no incentive for me to switch. Okay, so depending on the value of S, we have a Nash equilibrium with the subordinate individual always accepting and either the dominant individual giving a fair or unfair share depending on S. Basically, if it's unfair, biased towards itself, then it should be unbiased. It should be biased towards itself and select that. If it gives a fair share, then it should select a fair share. Or if it is biased towards the other individual, if it gives away more than half, then it should select an equal share. Kind of obvious. Okay, so let's think about expected payoffs. Oh, I've defined up here, by the way, that sigma F is going to be the probability that a dominant individual plays F. In fact, we don't even need the second part, sigma A. So let's think about expected payoffs for mixed strategies. See if there are any mixed strategy Nash equilibria. Okay, for our subordinate individual, their payoff if they play accept or reject is going to be equal to the probability that the dominant individual gives a fair share times by payoff if the subordinate individual accepts that fair share or rejects it, so B over 2 and 0. And then plus 1 minus the probability of an unfair share, so 1 minus sigma F, times by the payoff to the subordinate individual in the case it accepts, which is going to be, in this case, 1 minus S times by B. And it accepts an unfair share, and is going to be 0 if it rejects. We'll leave it in that form. So payoff is always 0 if it rejects. So remember, a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, we want to choose a value of sigma f, so a probability of giving a fair share that means that our subordinate individual is indifferent to changing its strategy. So we need these two things to be equal. That implies that sigma f times by b over 2 plus 1 minus sigma f times by 1 minus s times by b has to equal 0. These b's actually cancel out, doesn't actually matter what the value of b is here. So this has to equal 0, but this is only going to equal 0. Remember, sigma f is a probability and s is a proportion. So they're both between 0 and 1, inclusive. So this first term here is always going to be greater than or equal to 0. Likewise here, this is always going to be greater than or equal to 0. So this whole thing, this sum, is only going to be equal to 0 if sigma f is equal to 0 and s is equal to 1. By definition, though, this isn't going to be a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium because sigma f is our probability that our dominant individual gives a fair share. So this is already telling us that we can't actually have a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium here because our dominant individual is going to be playing a pure strategy. It's never going to give a fair share. So in other words, if the way of thinking about this, if sigma f is positive or s is less than 1. So in other words, if our we need sigma f to be positive and s to be less than 1, that our dominant individual is not always completely unfair, then our subordinate individual should always accept. Okay, so kind of becomes a little bit obvious when you look back at the payoff matrix here. For our subordinate individual, its payoff is always 0 whenever it rejects. So in this very simplistic game where there's no feedback effect going on here, this cost here doesn't actually even function into anything. You know, the C's didn't come into any of the analysis. So rejection here is never advisable for our subordinate individual. And if S here is greater than a half, so if our dominant individual can just decide to take more than half of the resource, as long as it doesn't take all of the resource, then it should just always end up in this scenario here. So this kind of creates a bit of an issue in terms of like understanding fairness in animal societies. Like, well, why don't the dominant individuals just always become and have this unfair behavior? One of the reasons is this is overly simplistic. You go then back to the assumptions that we put into this game. Well, there's questions there about, well, is there not some kind of additional punishment for beyond this, perhaps, that's captured here for our dominant individuals? Maybe there's a cost as well to our individuals of rejecting. Maybe there even might be a benefit of rejecting because there might be some iterated game where it increases your future payoff if you reject now. So again, this is a very simplistic. We had a question about, you know, this model doesn't seem very realistic. It's not a very realistic model, yeah.
So if we had S was equal to like a half, would we not be able to have a mixed strategy where the dominant player plays like each one a certain amount of time because it'll be like the same payout for the dominant player?
In a trivial sense, yes. In like that, everything would then be equal between these two rows. So this kind of collapses down in a similar way to the sex ratio one. It wouldn't matter whether they play fair or unfair because they're the same thing at that point. So their strategies become indifferent. So in a sense, yes. Okay, we're at time. Thank you, everyone. Just very quickly. So this is the end of the section that we're focusing on evolutionary game theory. We're going to be thinking about some additional methods. Adaptive dynamics is going to be the main focus as we're going to be going forwards. which deals with some of these issues. So like a key thing that's been coming back is a lot of these game theory models are overly simplistic and they focus on the end point. You know, what is an optimal strategy, say? Not much about how the evolutionary process works. We're going to be thinking more about those dynamics going forwards, which I think is a better way of modeling evolution. So I would take a lot of the stuff that we've done with evolutionary game theory, like I say, with a bit of a pinch of salt because the models are a bit overly simplistic in my view. Okay. Have a great weekend. I'll see you next week.